I want to start off with just sort of continuing a bit on what we talked about the last conversation we had on the synergy effect of classical architecture, because it just struck me. I mean, because we've seen that plenty of times throughout history, right? I'm thinking about you had the sack of Rome in 1527, right? And then which pope starts to rebuild at the end of the 16th century? And you get this whole surge, and of course then you get Caravaggio coming in there and plentiful of other names that just merge beautifully together. I just want to hear some thoughts from you on that aspect. I mean, merging architecture, painting, sculpture, and these things.
Absolutely. I think I mentioned last time that architecture is sometimes referred to as the mother art.
Yes.
And of course, then art in the old sense of something you do.
Yeah.
And I really believe in that. I really believe in architecture as something that can stimulate craftspeople and artisans. So that would be sculptors, painters, but also stonemasons, people who make sculpture or ornamental stonework, plasterers, people who do gold leaf, all those sort of professions which are, you could almost say, the remnants of an older structure where people would work more independently. It's not so centralized. So I've been thinking a little bit about centralized power lately and centralized systems, and somehow a lot of these professions are not as centralized, and that's one of the things I find interesting about them. And then when it comes to us as architects, I think that creating architecture or designing architecture that can provide a platform for those sorts of professions, it's a huge responsibility, it's a huge possibility. That I really think more people should grip that chance to play that role.
I mean, I visit this Facebook group, New Traditional Architecture.
Yeah.
And I see you can see quite a bit of examples of ornaments and furniture and interior carvings and stuff like that. But not so much sculpture and painting. I mean, I just want to elaborate a bit on that, wet dream where you have a collaboration between an architect's office that has sort of a stable of painters or whatever.
Yeah.
And if you can get that going, I think that could be really what this new renaissance that people are talking about all the time.
It's a beautiful vision, and there are tendencies. So I think you're onto something that's already a little bit happening out there.
Yeah.
But perhaps to organize it a bit more, to make it into a concept. Like you're talking about, like maybe to have an office where you have certain people that are connected to it, people who paint or make sculpture or also.
I mean, so it would be more like a movie production, right?
Yeah.
And that's what bring in. All,
I mean, if you go back to the Renaissance, I mean, all the great guys from that time were. I mean, they were everything. Michelangelo was an architect, interior designer, if that is a name. I don't know. And a painter, and what more was he? A sculptor, of course.
Yeah.
So they were everything. And I mean, even for a long time before the invention of art most academies this is academy for painting, sculpture, and architecture. You can see it inscribed on the wall of the old academy in Stockholm and other cities.
Yes.
So it was part of the same deal, and wasn't Vasari book, wasn't that the life of the painters, sculptors?
Greatest painters, sculptors, and architects.
Yeah. So those three were always combined until a certain point.
Yeah.
Because it was about creating the visual world around us. It was part of the same package.
Yeah. No, because it just strikes me that as a classical figurative painter, at least, I think you really get caught up in this. I have to get into a renowned gallery and exhibit and get reviews and whatever. I mean, I have renounced all that, but it would be nice to also have a place where you could actually do work.
yeah, absolutely. There are frescoes happening though. Remember we talked a little bit about there's a fresco workshop in Oslo, and so there's the new faculty of law has a huge new fresco and the new Fernando Nissen school has a big fresco. At least the first one is done like with the traditional technique. The other one might be oil or
but
even
it's still like
it's painted directly onto the wall.
Or contemporary modernistic.
Both of those are figurative, though.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
What is it?
Well, the first one is sort of like a human figure, a series of human figures doing similar movements, almost like those old photography reels of of a movement where you see from like late 19th, early 20th century of people doing different kinds of movements, and then you have a series of figures. So that's, I mean, it's nice.
Is it a photocopy-like, or is it Matisse-like in execution?
Oh, definitely Matisse-like.
Okay.
So it's along the tally. And then the Fernando Nissen one looks a lot like the ones at City Hall. So that's more like a socialist realism kind of style to it.
Yeah, what I've been thinking about is that, if you have that situation where it is normal to have that collaboration, like this film team coming together and working on that project. Like, if you've designed something, and we need something in the ceiling or on the walls here, but and how the light will come in, and so you and I have a conversation saying that, well, you need to compensate for the lighting when you do that, when you paint in those colors, right? And then you can get really out of this. Because that's a general problem, right? Then as a classical figurative painter, it's like my expression. I want to express myself instead of what are the rules of the craft? What is good storytelling? How do I achieve the effect that I do? And if I would have a cooperation with you, with such a team, then it's really being focused on the discipline, on what you actually, what painting is about. But through architecture.
It's a very different role, because the way that would happen in a modernist building right now, if someone were to do that sort of collaboration, there would definitely, I think, like a distance between the artist and the
architect expresses himself and the artist expresses himself.
And often the artist
it's the Tower of Babylon. The Babel.
And the artist will often come in with like an intention to somehow disturb what's happening there architecturally. Whereas I think if this is to be properly successful, it has to play along. So I know.
I just imagine it. All the things that need to go in that hall or whatever, or how the light falls in. There's sculptors standing there. Things you have to think about. How does that relate to the paintings that are going to be hanging there, or frescoes or whatever. That would just be amazing.
I think so too. And I really believe in that vision of yours. I think it's beautiful. Or our vision. It came up in our last conversation. And then of course the question is how can we make it happen?
Yeah, well, I think it's an important thing would be to in that. I don't know if it should be like a central. You can always make some group for it or some kind of a movement for it, but it would have to be. I know this is maybe naive, but so-called non-political in the sense, not favoring any specific type of painting, but of course, but of course being classical figurative. Yeah. So that one patron would perhaps like more sort of more minimalistic stuff, but still figurative, just calm landscapes. Another one wants some kind of Baroque thing going on, and just not having it art political, but just. This is what I want. Can you give me someone who can do that? Some kind of neutrality there has to be.
But I think I think it can't be unpolitical, but I think it can be unideological. That's possible. But it's just this is politics. This is thoughts about how cities should be built, and that is polis. So I think that the politics for the last 100 years have become very ideological, and I think therefore these conversations are very difficult to have. And in Norway now, with all this discussion with the architectural revolt, it's sort of the big question now is which political party will take it up first, and of course then the crisis comes, because then it becomes a partisan issue.
I'm hoping that the architectural uprising won't be that sort of thing where it suddenly belongs to one side of politics or the others, and I think it can happen that people agree across the board about these things.
I mean, that's why we contacted you in the first place, right?
True. I believe so too, and I see that people have approached this from different standpoints. Of course, For me, it's a lot to do with environmental issues, climate change, loss of habitat, loss of species, biodiversity, because I believe that that focusing on things that are universal or timeless, that is something that it's a sort of counterweight to the mandate of always spending more and more money and buying new things and consumerism. So that's one of the fascinating things about it for me.
Do you think it's a good way to argue to bring in the environmental issue?
Yeah.
When it comes to classical architecture.
Oh, definitely, absolutely. It's. I mean, to me, it's quite obvious that modernist architecture is consumerist architecture.
Yeah, because I mean, it's torn down after 20, 30 years or
usually,
whatever.
Or less.
Yeah.
Like one of the new buildings down in Björvika was completely renovated. It was 10 years old, I think.
Yeah, 12 years old.
12 years old.
Also, the renovation cost more than building it, so it was. You could say that it was rebuilt.
Yeah, almost.
Yeah.
And it looks quite similar, I think. I don't think it looks very different, but I'm sure it's very important.
And it sucks energy like crazy because of all the glass. So it has to be heated up during the winter, and it has to be cooled in the summer, and it costs a lot of money.
That's the weird thing,
And you spend a lot of electricity doing that.
Yeah.
You could have spent it otherwise.
Yeah. But that's what, on that note, then what is that what's the math on the cost of making classical architecture versus modern, so-called modern?
I mean, on the long term, of course, it's a lot cheaper. I think we can say that for sure. No, the classical architecture is much cheaper.
Long term, yes. Okay, yeah.
I think usually it's more expensive in the short term because all of these companies that creates stuff for the builders, they have created a recipe. Like a Lego game almost. And if you stick to the recipe, things will always be cheaper, of course, because they can deliver it fast. They don't have to make a special design or make a special...
Have you seen that? Speaking of that, have you seen, I saw in the New Traditional Architecture, I think it was the guy who runs it, Michael Diamond, said that Ralph Lauren is someone we really should thank. And he posted some photos of, that was completed in 2010, I think, on Madison Avenue.
Yeah,
and it's like a little chateau there.
It's wonderful. I've seen the Ralph Lauren in Tokyo as well, which is very similar in expression. And of course, it's in one way it's a stage set. It's similar to movies again, to films again, because in Tokyo you can't have load-bearing outer walls because of the seismic activity. So there's too many earthquakes there. But still, the architecture and the expression of it is so universal. It appeals to people across cultures. You were just showing us the medals from the Olympics, the Tokyo Olympics, which also have this...
Where you have the sculpture that we saw in Olympia.
Yeah.
By Pausanias.
Pausanias,
sorry. Yeah. Pausanias is the historian, or was it the other way? No, Pausanias is the historian.
Yes.
Pausanias is the sculptor. And where they have simply copied that Nick sculpture and finished her body and on the gold medal, and she's landing. Is that sculpture? And then you see the Acropolis in the background.
Yeah, and that's also from Tokyo, which, according to some, I guess, according to some sources, you would say that this is completely absurd. Why would you do this like Western ideal in the middle of Japan, so far away?
Right.
But it works because it expresses universal values.
Yeah, I mean, just look at the 8th century Japanese sculpture.
Yeah.
And you have an extreme power and force, and it's realistic.
Yeah.
You know, it's the idea that that's Western is just bonkers.
I agree.
No, but it is. I mean, it's a heritage from ancient Greece because they are celebrating. In the Olympic Games is a way of celebrating Nike, because Nike is about succeeding in something, victory.
Yeah.
Come from, isn't her Roman name Vittoria or something?
Exactly, yeah.
So, and if you were to celebrate Aphrodite, it would not be like the Olympic Games. It would maybe Miss Universe. They could have a medal of Aphrodite.
Sure. Well, they would have to get fatter, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think if it should be really properly done, they should have had a competition in lovemaking and give a prize to the woman who's the best at lovemaking.
But and you don't even need, I think, that sort of conceptual frame that you're constructing there around it, because you can just look at this item, see this is beautiful, this speaks to me, and that's an experience that would be shared by 95% of the world's population when they see something like that.
This is a touch upon what we had talked about in our conversation, or you mentioned how buildings reflect the human proportions or natural proportions.
And
which is the same.
Gravity and these very simple rules of like what sort of buildings, what sort of environments are appealing and are comforting to us. And so I was there, of course, in Tokyo with my class from architecture school, and my fellow students were like, ugh, when they saw that Ralph Lauren building, because all they saw was copies and fakery and something inauthentic. So they belong to the other 5% that don't appreciate that. But again, the other 95% would just walk by that building and be like, wow, this is so much more beautiful than almost everything else in this street. And the fact of the matter is that just because of the design, that building might well last longer than almost everything around it. Because timeless...
Like in terms of structure, the whole...
Because the beauty is timeless, because the appeal of it is universal.
Yeah.
And
but I mean that 5% is that have contempt against it. It's it's a little bit like Jung says that contempt against others is actually contempt against yourself. That they are not describing the building; they're describing something in themselves that they are ashamed of.
I suppose so.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. But it's interesting then that you have this, the arguments for classical architecture, reflecting nature, human nature. Environmentally friendly, long-term, lower costs, and and modernist architecture, as you say, you have to spend much more money, and well, that's the environmental argument again.
And then, sorry.
No.
And then the question is, why does it appeal? Who is responsible, or what is it about modernist architecture that has kept it alive for 100 years now, while most people don't appreciate it? I think it's a very difficult but important question, because I think we need to understand, if we want this new renaissance, as you call it, we need to understand what we're working against. And I don't quite understand. I think there's several theories. I think one of the things has something to do with purity. The idea that the world has to be clean, has to be authentic. You have to scrape away the stuff that's superficial or feminine, right? That ornament, textile, cosmetics, these are inauthentic, these are dishonest and immoral factors of culture. And then, on the other hand, a lot of them are exactly what makes the world livable, I think.
Well, I mean, this is when you get into the whole cultural historical background for why people are thinking like they're thinking. Reading Kant's Critique of Judgment, the basic thing is that he's concerned with purity, and that's why you get it. That's Laws, right? Who talks about the ornament as a crime. Yeah. Because that is not pure. That is something that can affect you and make you like the building better. So that's like an ideological issue. But then there's also this. Yeah. I was thinking about it in a broader, sort of more fundamental idea. Is this Hegelian idea of having to belong to the zeitgeist, and that the zeitgeist is expressed through the state, and the state is the sum of all the individuals, so it has supreme knowledge somehow. This really religious way of thinking. So I think when the state then, because of course a lot of these things are made by the state and approved by the state, and then private developers follow up on that, then that has a really strong force. But it is a purity idea, or a drive for purity.
Yeah, and why does that appeal to the state, I guess you could ask? Because my hope is that a democratic society can also be beautiful, or it can be friendly, or can be a gentle place, and can accommodate classical architecture, can accommodate this renaissance of artisans, this group of ours with sculptors and painters and architects and craftspeople. and to find a room for that within modern society. But that of course begs the question, ideas me up, what is modernity? And are we still in it? And if we are, how do we meet it? I mean, you guys do something that a lot of people view as anti-modern or unmodern, something that doesn't fit in the times we're in. So if I can ask you two a big question, that would be, how do you relate to that question of modernity, and whether you are able, in the ways that you guys work, to respond to society the way it is now, or are you just not interested? I guess that would be a different approach. But yeah, if the idea is that we're living in some version of modernity, how do we meet that and still remain loyal to those ideals?
Well, it's basically what you described just a minute ago. You have to be aware of what you're up against, so that you know where those values come from, so you don't think that it's just the zeitgeist and then everybody has to follow, right? And then of course finding, personally, this has nothing to do with architecture, but reading books on screenwriting, because then they are not affected by these arty ideas, and you just go, what is how do you create a good story, right? So I think that's really important. I don't know how that would play out in architecture, how you can, because architecture is seen as art, and as you talked about, you have all of those problems. I mean, we know it's the same situation, right? So I don't know where you can get information on classical architecture outside the traditional art school or architecture schools.
No, I believe in telling stories as well. The narrative, one of the books that I brought last time from Quinlan Terry, he's often described as a narrative architect. He sort of tells stories with his buildings, with these rows of facades. And I've seen a couple of projects quite recently that are sort of telling a story where in one way it's quite it's very inauthentic, but it's beautiful. So, but you have a single building and you give it a lot of like narrow facades with different colors, with different detailing, and thus you get an experience of something that's more human scale and more comfortable to walk along. So that's one answer to it. But yeah, do you believe in modernity?
I would like to answer that, because I often have a problem with when you have one field of study and you mix it somewhere into something where it doesn't belong. I don't know if I'm phrasing it correctly, but for example, Kant made an aesthetic that was actually an ethic. I don't believe it's an aesthetic philosophy. I believe we haven't really had the proper aesthetic philosophy since Aristotle. Because in the Poetics, let's talk about what people like in theater, for example. And he observes that people eat their lunch if it's not exciting enough. And I mean, that's aesthetic philosophy. He's looking at how people react to entertainment, right? How do they sense it? And what can we say about when people enjoy it? And so forth. Kant says, you're not supposed to like that. And that's ethics, it's not aesthetics.
Exactly.
And it's a little bit the same with modernity. Modernity is not... It means that you are up to date in some ways. And so it's not an objective judgment, because it changes all the time. So it's more a social thing. Oh God, Lauren, you're so up to date. It's a social thing of the timeline of our lives or something like that. It's not an objective thing. And so to mix that into an objective study such as architecture, I think is really problematic, and I can't really take it seriously. I have to take it seriously because we're suffering.
You have to relate to it.
But it's a little bit the same as if you're in law and you make a law that has to be understood subjectively. For example, if it's stood in an original law book, don't be mean. You can get up to a 3,000 kroner fine. The problem with that is that it's not an objective measurement. You cannot objectively measure when you are mean. It has to be a subjective measurement. And that is the modern architecture, the modern paint in the art or whatever. is subjectivism implemented where it shouldn't be.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Because I believe in that we should treat people with respect, and we shouldn't treat people bad if they make bad paintings, for example. That is a sort of a feminine principle of caretaking, caritas, you know?
Yeah.
But you don't mix caritas into an objective study, then you have to have objective criteria.
Answering a bit further on that question of yours,
Yeah.
I want to say something on aesthetics, because I think we need to scrap the term at all, aesthetics and beauty, not build it on that, because it struck me. I mentioned that term, that the Greeks had. What was it? When they talked about sculpture, they talked about the no. It meant the intensity of the figure. It wasn't a formal term. Anyways, it was a term not describing the way it was made, the technique, the polish or whatever, but of the intensity, the presence of the figure.
Yeah.
And I think that Aristotle
is similar to Italian word animate.
I guess so, yeah. And I was thinking, when I think of Aristotle, I wouldn't say he's made an aesthetics. He's made a book on how you tell stories and why that affects you. So you have to not build classical culture, if it's architecture or painting, on the idea of aesthetics in the modern sense at any rate, but on the eternal perspective, the mythical perspective, and on relating to the human being, which is basically the same thing. Right?
But okay, so I agree with that. But then the things that we produce, when we have these things in mind, they look old. They often look like something that was made more than a century ago. And so the accusation, like one of the things we talked about when we talked about what we wanted to talk about today, was like, why is modern classical architecture referred to as fake, as something from Disneyland, as something that's dishonest and doesn't belong? And I guess sometimes you guys would get the same critique that this looks old. Why are you doing something that looks like it's from 100 years ago or more? And I think we need to have a proper answer for that question. Like, are we trying to do something that sort of skips the feeling of modernity? I think Öde Nerdrum one time said that modernism will be a parenthesis in history or something along those lines. And that's, of course, a very valid opinion. But I think we do need to think about whether is it a problem? Is it a problem that the stuff we do looks old-fashioned, or isn't it? And of course, the other question would be: would it be possible to follow these principles and still somehow reply to that criticism? Well, are you guys upset when people say that your stuff looks old or old-fashioned?
Well, it's always a question of what is the context and which fights do you pick. What you can do is quite simply explain that the reason why things look old-fashioned is because they are timeless.
Yeah.
And you have to hammer that one point in.
Yeah. Because
what is modern has to be modern. That's a punchline.
Yeah.
That's one word. And of course, I think like we talked about, and I've talked about with other people too, working in other fields, that when the teacher says you have to be modern, and then I ask, well, did the teacher explain why? No, there's no explanation.
No.
Right. So I think what you can do, you can either, if this context is ripe for it, you can explain it over a longer term. If not, you can just sort of get the punchline in that it's eternal. That's the basic thing. The mythical, the eternal perspective is the important thing.
So the answer is sort of that it doesn't upset you. It doesn't upset you when people say that.
It doesn't upset me personally because I can't take it seriously. I mean, for example, when they made homosexuality illegal in Norway in the 70s, no one said, "Hey, you're just going back to antiquity." You know, no one said that. And
I'll start saying that. Oh, you're so old-fashioned.
I mean, if you're making a building that looks like a 19th century building, for example, you could say that looks like 19th century building, but you could change the focus and said, what about all the other things we're building now? Why the hell does that not look like we built it before? You can turn the situation around. What is the reason why you're not building like before? And you have to have a very good reason to do that, I think, to change course. If you're taking a ship and you're changing course, I mean, you have to justify it. And I don't think it has been justified. I think it has been in closed intellectual rooms. But for example, in architecture, it's even worse than painting because it affects everyone's life because they have to see it. And according to the principles of human decency, the individual life, that he has some sort of right to have a good life, all these values from antiquity, they are not justified under the modern architecture.
But do we not live in modern times then, you think? Like, is it not true that...
No, it's not true, because because in 2,000 years this will be old times.
Yeah.
So therefore, it's not a real world. It's a fairy tale.
Yeah.
thing.
So that's the Disneyland, I guess.
That's the real Disneyland. Yeah. Yes. So we have to realize that we live in very old times.
Yeah. And that's why you don't.
And
need
until
to
we
make
realize
things
that, things will not improve.
Yeah.
I think.
So that would be your reply, that we do not live in times.
Already when you ask that question, that's old times.
Yeah, no, I agree, but it's still
a couple of seconds ago already.
Yeah, I mean, for a worm, that's a lifetime.
it's still our main challenge, though, to get that point through. That if we agree that we don't live in modernity, and thus what we make does not need to be significantly different from what was made before, then of course that is still, I think, a big task to prove, or at least like get that point through. I like your idea of just saying, like, in 20,000 years this is very old-fashioned. This is olden days. But I do think that a lot of people feel that there's something inherently different about our time compared to earlier times, and that's why architecture, painting, sculpture. Then that's why it needs to be inherently different. It needs to be like tangibly different, the architecture, painting, sculpture, music, because our time is inherently different.
Well, but
I'm not quite sure I agree, but that is what a lot of people do.
I liked a little bit the idea when they started to develop the human rights codex, which is very interesting, because they said that regardless of what happened, we believe these to be eternal human rights. That's very interesting. I'm not sure if I agree with all of the points there. But it should be able to make something like that in aesthetics, that sort of eternal human aesthetics, things that people like regardless of culture, regardless of time. It's true in Japan, it's true in Indonesia, it's true in Norway and America, wherever, maybe even Greenland. That could be possible.
Yeah, I think architectural psychology is one of the closest things you'll get to those principles you're asking for there. There's a lot of studies in architecture psychology and environmental psychology. That's environment in the broad sense, that are on to those principles, I think. And it's a lot of the principles we talked about last time. To have variation, to have ornaments, proportion, to see that something is carried, something is carrying what is carried. To see gravity expressed, and that comfort that lies in something that's similar to nature without being identical to nature. Buildings that are similar to each other without being identical. Organized complexity. Yeah. That's those two words. They keep following me, and they have for 20 years now. Since I first heard the term organized complexity, it still follows me around, because I think there's so much to it. Something that's complex, but with a sort of rule behind it.
Or another thing, you could say that it's a sort of a masculine, feminine things, that it's order and playfulness, and has to balance those two.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about also something I really became aware of, reading on books on screenwriting, and the conversation had a conversation on classical poetry with Thomas Lerland. that I think there are some mistakes you can make when it comes to figurative painting. I think if just the proportions and the colors are correct, it's fine. Or in poetry, if it's just rhymes, it's fine. Or in architecture, if it's just there are some ornaments there, then it's fine.
Yeah.
And I think because that's something I wanted to hear you guys talk about a little bit. This idea of just having the correct proportions without. I mean, you can have beautiful buildings more or less without any ornaments, but the proportions are just perfectly in place.
Do you have an example you want to?
Do we look at that?
I think Uppsala is a great example of that old city. So many beautiful streets there. The old parts there, and there's no ornaments.
Really?
It's just a matter of how the windows are placed, and I guess you could say that architecture. It's taken out to three things when it comes to fine architecture. It's the proportions, which is the most important, and then it's the materials you use, and then it's ornaments. It's those three. Don't you agree?
Yes, absolutely.
I would say it's in that order of importance.
I agree. I believe in ornament. I think it's important, but I do agree that there's a lot of great buildings that don't have a lot of like figurative ornament. I just think that it adds another layer. It adds a level of complexity of engagement when you see something that you recognize, and it's to do with biophilia. That other term that I also think is extremely important. Biophilic architecture is architecture that imitates nature. And I think that's what you observe in Uppsala, because the way that the buildings there are built up towards the sky, and perhaps with like arched windows and like bigger proportions.
But it's in the
ground floor.
The street that bends and it's the whole thing.
Which is similar to a trail through a forest, let's say, or curves of an animal body.
I think there's a lot of examples of that just in villages, like I gave a painting course in Cotignac in Provence a couple of years, and also you can see these villages like in Scotland that sort of just grow up off the earth, just it's like some cave or whatever. But it doesn't have a lot of ornaments and stuff. But it's just, well, of course, there's a lot of material there that is very, very appealing. But it's also about the proportion, the placement of the windows, like you said.
Of course. But I think that if we have that order of importance, I think. And we have talked about that. How do we think about 3D printing and these things? And I think we need to choose our battles and choose what is most important, because it's very easy to become like a super eco-fascist, and we have to have natural materials and everything, and everything has to be complete renaissance.
3D printing meaning
or like carving or
serialized produced.
I don't think we should say no to that, because what is missing most today is the sense of proportions and the acceptance that there is something called universal harmony. In the drawing, and then perhaps we can swallow the camels. Then we can swallow the fact that it will be mass produced or 3D printed, whatever. Because
maybe you'll get 2 out of 3 or something.
That's a lot.
Yeah, that's a great improvement.
It would be, and maybe you'll get a lot of
0 out of 3 or 2 out of 3.
You'll get a lot of biophilia then,
because
too.
I can even see now that a lot of modernist architecture. It looks horrible, and then they buy these fancy rocks or fancy marble and adds it on top, and then they say, but hello.
But it's natural.
It's the finest marble in the world.
Yes.
So, and that's clear, all new buildings in Oslo now almost have quite good material, so it's not a matter of material problem here. It's just that you can't see it. I mean, like you told me, I saw this new building in Oslo now, and it looks as if the architects have gone back to this 50s modernism, really straight, and then Christian tells me, that's a really special rock they've used. I couldn't see that.
It
reminds me of that painter we were talking about, this painter, and he was shape shifting, becoming himself. And I was criticizing that, and then the other person was saying, but he knows the models personally. So what the hell does that have to do with the painting?
No, exactly. And what's sad, of course, about those examples is that you'd expect it to have more impact. You'd expect the opera house, let's say, because it's clad in Carrara marble, to have more of the refinement that should follow with that material. And in the end, it's just a very simple piece of landscape architecture with an opera house tucked inside. And it's good landscape architecture, but it doesn't quite rub off the quality of the material. Doesn't improve it as much as you think it would. And the opera house is one thing. The other building you're talking about, that's even worse because it's so abstract. That's another word I want to talk to you guys about. Abstraction, because it seems for 100 years now, whenever you want to modernize something, you have to abstract it. That's the way of making something more modern or something more current, more relevant, is to simplify it and make it more, to add abstraction to it, or yeah. And I've been sort of searching for, are there other ways of expressing society or expressing something conceptual than abstraction? Is there another modernity? I've been talking a lot about self-expression or the right to define yourself, and perhaps that's another modernity, another modernism, another an alternative to abstraction.
But I don't think you have the right to express yourself.
No.
Because nature always wins. I mean, you can go around. I have the right to be homosexual or something, but if you are heterosexuals, you clearly don't have that right to define yourself because nature has overruled you. And it's the same here, that we don't have that right. There are certain things that works in architecture that makes a pleasant city, and there are certain things that don't.
I think. Sorry.
No, I was finished.
I think what people really need is not to express themselves. What people need is to see themselves in a long-term perspective.
Yeah.
And that's where we're getting back to classical architecture, because it is eternal, because it relates to the human proportions and these things.
So you mean, so in your opinion, that whole like diversity, all kinds of things happening at the same time, that's not the most strategic way of arguing the case.
In what way do you mean?
Because I think one of the good arguments these days for classical architecture is that we live in very diverse times, and diversity is seen as strength, is seen as an ideal, is seen as something that's positive for everyone. Partly inspired by ecology, of course, where a diverse ecosystem is much more resilient. A diverse ecosystem will never be destroyed.
It's not popular on all levels of diversity. It's very much focused on sexual diversity. But for example,
racial diversity.
No, but for example, when England voted, or Britain voted to leave the EU, this is undisputed. Them leaving the EU will make a more diverse economy in Britain. That's undisputed, because London will lose its status as the economic city on behalf of the EU, and England will be forced to create more industries across the country. So, and this is undisputed, that it will create a more diverse economy. But that was wrong. They said that you were more or less racist if you supported Brexit. You know? So I don't think diversity is proclaimed on all levels. I think it's focused on sexuality, races.
Well, in architecture, diversity is very big these days. Like, go to a diploma exhibition at an architecture school. There is a lot of different stuff going on, and that's real.
Is there anything you would describe as classical?
Huh?
Is there anything you would describe as classical?
Just like maybe a few things, but there's a lot of stuff that's like, let's say, ethnically inspired, for example. Or my diploma project that was inspired by queerness. There's some of that stuff happening.
That's like, that was your protective shield, right?
Exactly. That's my argument.
But I think that's a sidetrack, because you've always been inspired by this and that. Like when they made Victoria Station in Bombay, you put in some Indian elements there and have fun with that. But that is not the issue here. The issue here is that they don't believe in a universal harmonic principle. That is the central issue.
I agree that's an issue. Sorry.
You could say that, well, tactically you could use diversity as some kind of a wedge to...
Yeah, that's the idea.
So the question then is, okay, is that smart long-term, or will that just lead to when you first choose a route where you're trying to be sort of tactical, that you also adjust accordingly, and then it just falls apart, or your project as a classical architect, for example, falls apart. I don't know. It's a matter of your personal integrity. Then
it might be. There's a relativism in it that's, of course, somehow dangerous. But right now, it seems to me it's what we have. It's the best thing we had. But of course, it's completely opposite to your argument, Öde.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if the diversity, if it is on behalf of human decency, I mean, to accept human longings. Not that we can be anything we want. There are 170,000 genders or something, but to just accept you do that, and our nature is like this. This is, to go back to ancient Greece, which perhaps more than any culture accepted human nature.
Yeah.
Then I could like it, but the way it looks now, where it's very ideological, and it seems like they are a little bit like the modernists, a little bit on that we can overrule nature in the philosophy. That I think is the bad way to go. We have to rather follow a direction where we understand more than ever that nature is our master. So perhaps the environmental movement, for example, is a better track.
Yeah.
And you could say also, touching a bit on what you said, how do you actually create such a, like this My Wet Dream, the film team thing, and maybe then the solution is just to, instead of sort of trying to reform the whole area, just find some architect firm that really understands this, and just go by example.
That's very credible. That the problem isn't ideological or in the arguments; it's in the practice. Might
just proof. I mean, of course.
Yeah,
but
proof is in the pudding.
That's
what the Americans say.
There's proof all over the place, but we just don't get to hear about it in the mass media and these things. I mean, it's we've talked about it. There's you go to new traditional architecture and all the other groups. There's a bunch of good news when it comes to architecture. But there's one question that I think is important, and I don't know if you could answer it, foreign politician, but of course you would know the laws governing architecture and what you can build and not build and these things. Is there something that has to be done there, or is that like really the arduous way in to solving the problem? Because are public laws governing what can be built, are they a big part of the problem? Because it's typical thing, they have this they have a hotel from 1890, you want to expand it like it was supposed to be, but no, then it has to be modern, you have to build everything in glass, and then, But then that's public laws, right?
There are a lot of arguments that go in that direction, like, you can't do this. And then, of course...
And that's ideology, cemented in public administration.
Yeah, and there might be traces of that in the law as well. Or in the rules of building, or that sort of thing, that there are, of course, different conditions. Buildings are built very differently now from the way they were built 100 years ago, usually. And one of the reasons is because we're much better at insulating, which is good because less people die from pneumonia in insulated buildings. So if you have something inside the walls that prevent you from getting very cold in the winter and hopefully also getting overheated in the summer, that is a good thing. But the argument there is that buildings are built in a completely different way, and that's why you can't continue these principles, which I disagree with. There's obviously ways to move around it technically, and there's also ways of doing alternative ways. Like, let's say, back in the days, a masonry building or a stone building would have load-bearing outer walls, so the walls would also hold up the floors in the different floors above ground. And they don't do that anymore, because then you get cold directly into the floors from the facade. Very well, you can't do it the same way. But what you can do is you can build walls, the outer walls, masonry or stone or whatever, they can still hold themselves up. Then you can have insulation, and then you can have another structure inside where the floors are supported in a different way. And then you have solved the problem. And then you have an outer wall which is still beautiful, which is still adhering to these laws of gravity and the principles of something that lasts for a long time, while on the inside you can have all those qualities that come with modern ways of building. And I don't see that problem. But going back to the laws, there might be a possibility of creating laws at least that emphasize more. Let's say public buildings should be built in a way that minimizes the need to renovate. So
exactly. So you have a principle coming in that is not clear in terms of what style has to be built, but it's a general principle.
Yeah, and I think that with that mindset, classical architecture would very often win, or at least become much more relevant.
And that, because then you could argue not in terms of style, but in terms of
environmental qualities, for example, because it's anti-consumerist. It's the opposite of just throwaway culture. So those sort of ideas, I think, are very relevant. But it is a big question, like how to introduce things properly. I know that in Sweden, where this movement has come quite far, there have been municipal architectural competitions where the rules of the competition state that it should be a classical building, and then so that's another way of doing it. And then it's up to the different firms to interpret what does classicism mean, and then in the end the public gets to choose between the different projects. So that's a way of doing it. Like you can use the language of style in competitions. You can use it in the plans that are drawn up for an area. That's and that's the sort of thing I think you can sell in as more of like a diversity idea that.
And these suggestions have come across party line, or?
Yeah, I believe so. Especially like in Gothenburg, there's a lot of different parties that are interested in this stuff. Then other parts of Sweden, it's mostly people on the right. But that's of course like. My background is in social democratic politics, and I don't see myself as on the right. I have some conservative views, but especially culturally. But I don't see myself as a conservative. I don't think there's like one big conservative project politically and aesthetically. But so I think that this is an issue that can belong across party lines, and that's a tendency I think I'm seeing in these different places as well. So that makes me hopeful, but there's still some work to do in getting that understanding across, and that's why I asked you a question about modernity as well. Is that our main accusation is that you're doing something that doesn't belong in this time, and we need to have really good, sharp arguments against that.
Well, I think the whole world now is part of a more like a. Forsøk, so it's a test. We have been in this lab now for 100 years, testing out the extreme skepticism philosophy that was established late 1800, 1900. That basically, fundamentally, it says observation is fault. If you observe that people like a certain environment, you're saying that, yeah, but how can you say that environment is better? The skepticism attacks the observation, and that's really dangerous because all philosophy has to start with observation. That is, what Aristotle does there. Okay, I can see that they are eating their lunch bag
instead of looking at the theater.
Why are they doing that? Instead of saying that we cannot possibly say anything about that. I mean, and that is what this skepticism movement is saying. They are saying that they are refusing to believe that. Well, I'm having trouble talking here.
But do you think, one thing is, and this is so cemented that you can even have quite good arguments, but it doesn't necessarily hit at least in the first round. But one thing is that didn't you mention that once? This thing about how the modernist architecture looks like some early medieval architecture.
Yeah.
I mean,
in Bologna, if you see old images from Bologna, for example, it looks like Manhattan. The whole city is full of towers, and then you see the image of the towers, but they're quite nice. But you have to remember that those few towers that are left there, they built some things on them during the Renaissance to make them nicer, because in the Middle Ages they were extremely flat. So like flat big stone buildings, and the only thing that's charming about them perhaps is that they're made out of real bricks. So they didn't have the technology to make them as horrible as they are made today, but still it goes for the same. It's I don't know what was the practicality in these towers. Maybe it was some sort of
I think it was mostly aesthetic. It was to show off, basically.
Okay. Yeah. It's a sort of follows thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Their way of showing off is to show that they can make big buildings as big genitals in a way. Yeah. So, and that is then you have a culture that is very off. Yeah.
And then your thesis would be then that sort of just self-corrects after another century passes, and then...
No, I don't think it self-corrects by itself. I think all changes in society is done by humans in some ways.
Okay, so what do we need to do then? Like, we have the anti-consumerist argument, and we have the diversity argument. Those are the main two that I can find right now. But I'm very interested in more arguments for how could we turn this around.
Well, I think what separates the Renaissance from the Middle Ages was that they saw that the need of the man was paramount to everything else. And, you know, as you say, showing off is a sign of human weakness. It's a pride thing. It's not love.
And maybe you can appeal to that pride. You can just say, if you belong to your time, you will die along with it.
What? Sorry, how?
If you belong to your time, what you do.
Yeah.
Then your buildings, your paintings will die along with the time, because it's not socially advantageous to say that I own that painting or I'm living in that house. Or whatever. I don't know. Do you think that? I mean, if you want to be slightly mean, to just look at modernists and say, well, you know, you're dead tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the arguments.
Because there is a pride in every human being.
Yeah.
Then now we're talking tactics.
Tactics are important. I probably shouldn't publish this interview. So just I think these arguments are interesting to talk about, because there are tactics.
I think that is not just something that you would say to be, you know, to get that other guy or whatever. Because I do think it's what do you call it? Empirical description. Yeah. Things that are typical of their time is typically what we laugh of later.
Yeah. That's.
And do you really want to be that person? You know, who just at most you're interesting as a document of the time.
Yeah. No, I think a lot of people don't want that. I think a lot of people want to grasp at something else. So that's true. That's a good thing to appeal to. I think you just gave me a third argument. Yeah. I think and this, of course, connected to the anti-consumerist argument.
But what do you guys think of this? Because you have that, which is a modernist idea, I guess, to say that if you strip things down, then you get the essence, and that is more eternal. That's the real shit. You know? What would you say to that?
I think I have to come back to the perhaps the masculine and feminine. I would say that argument has a lot of misogyny in it. Like. There's a lot of...
So yesterday.
It's so yesterday. Oh my God, I'm so over misogyny. You're over it, I'm over it.
Well, then you have Sparta and Athens, which were like two opposites in antiquity. Sparta was really masculine, and all the boys needs to go into the military when they're age 2 or 3. And then you have Athens. And Athens was actually bullied a little bit. In a lot of other city-states, they said, oh God, those girls in Athens.
Yeah, but who persisted? Athens did. The Spartan society
but
didn't last very long in that form.
The Athenians couldn't. That was so funny after the war with Pericles. I mean, in just a matter of 2 generations, most Athenians, they couldn't fight at all. They could just cite poetry and paint and sculpt.
But again, Spartan society didn't survive in that shape very long, because it sort of crumbled under its own strict rules and the inequalities of that society. I think you mentioned Jung earlier, and of course that integration between the masculine and the feminine, and recognizing the feminine is one argument against that whole scraping off, getting into the core, because
the woman has no core. I mean, read Håvamål.
Oh, yes.
You know,
That's a good argument.
so that's the problem, and it's homophobic, it's racist. There's so many problems with that idea of purity and getting into the core, because it assumes that everything that has this sort of extra or something that's exuberant is inauthentic, is immoral.
Yeah, and if you're really getting into the, if you shall think tactical, using what is seen as negative in our time and using that against sort of modernist architecture, or the whole modern idea. I mean, this comes to a large degree from Kant. And then you get to the point where it's so strange that these things that are politically correct are defined by white European men. This is a typical problem today, right? As if it would be a problem in itself, but it's a fact, neutral fact in any case. And he wants to get to that core, the pure judgment, the purity. That's why you get as we mentioned, the loss and the ornament is forbidden.
Yeah.
So he cuts away everything that human beings need to see yourself reflected in something else.
Yeah.
The basic human need is what he cuts out and says it is not allowed. So, I mean, then again, if you want to really use contemporary lingo, you can say this is something that stands on the side of the oppressor against the oppressed, which is what we really need as beings of nature.
yeah, true. So that's I think perhaps that's both with what you were talking about and my question about the abstraction is that you have to look at it from that angle, perhaps.
Yeah, the mythical perspective, or the body, or
because the myths, because the myths, they are also wrapped usually in details and in texture and in I don't know, they're situated in time, space. If you just tell a pure myth, that sounds quite weird. Or if you paint a painting that just expresses a myth without having any specifics, without the specific, there's very little narrative left, I guess. And I don't know, how would you view that, the relationship between the core and the wrapping when you're retelling a myth, for example? And can that be repeated in architecture, for example?
That's a general question.
I know, I'm sorry. You don't have to answer it, but I
just want to make one more comment about the purity, that this big study that was made a few years ago in England, London, where they tested humans' behavior in front of architecture. Have you heard about it?
Maybe, but
where a guy asked to borrow someone's phone, and they compared that to in a classical city space and a modernist, and they tried to make them fairly similar in terms of what kind of income the people had there, etc. And it turned out that people were 7 times more likely to borrow a phone to you in a classical environment than a modernist environment.
Very interesting.
And not just that, they did many tests such as that one. So it was also that they were willing to tell you the time. They were like 3 times more likely to tell you what time it was. Other nice gestures. And you could say that is unpure. To make the assumption that that's better architecture because people behave better there, that's an unpure judgment. But what a wonderful impurity.
It is a wonderful impurity.
Yes.
It's messy and diverse.
It's messy and diverse. The way we like it. Or the way I like it anyway.
Don't go into detail, please.
Yeah. And there's a study about courthouses, I think, in America as well, where they try to control for all the other factors, and when you have courthouses, you see that people get longer prison sentences in modernist courthouses than in classical courthouses.
It makes people meaner.
Yeah. It makes the judges stricter and the juries angrier. So I find that quite fascinating that architecture can bring out these things in us, because it's very far away from that abstract idea of a philosophical age that we're in, that's conceptual that's the idea of modernity.
Basic misunderstanding that is at the root of Kant's and these Kant's ideas, and that we're fighting with today. That if you take away everything that relates to your personal feelings or emotions, whatever, then you reach objectivity. I mean, this is like what manifests in the French Revolution. You cut the head off, then everybody are the same. Right? It's like you have just the head, the body, get it away, just the head. You know.
Yeah, you might as well build a society for frogs. Because when you take humans out of the equation, who are we building society for? We're not humans. Okay, build it for frogs then. I mean, I don't know who they're building for now. Maybe it's the snakes or I don't know the...
Well, the snakes have no limbs, so that's probably,
But it's definitely not for humans.
Yeah.
It's a pure judgment.
Yeah. Do you have more time?
If I have more time?
Yeah.
I have all the time in the world for you, my friend.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
There's one other aspect of this that I touched upon it when talking about the environmental issues with climate change, loss of biodiversity, that connects with the use of energy. And we mentioned it a bit earlier, talking about how different kinds of energy uses and dispersal of energy might influence culture. There's like this tiny field of academia called energy humanities, which talks about is there such a thing as petroleum culture or like fossil fuel culture? Because there's a lot of sameness in the world now. That's sort of the thesis, at least for my field, for architecture. Buildings become more and more similar all over the world. And one of the ways that has become possible is because you're spending a lot of energy creating glass buildings in all kinds of environments. Whether it's too cold or too hot, you compensate by burning oil in order to heat up or cool down these buildings. Or with shipping, like you're shipping building materials all over the world with these huge tank ships. Which again, that also imposes this sameness on architecture everywhere. Another source, of course, is the flow of information with the internet, and that's a different source of sameness. But I do think, for example, with Georgian architecture, that some people are quite critical of the flatness of Georgian buildings. They can be a bit too box-like. They don't have a lot of the organic or corporeal qualities that buildings...
When you say some, you mean me?
Yeah, like you talked about that.
I'm the only one I know
certain
about.
forces.
Well, your father also doesn't like flat facades. He's very into like the... You know?
Yes.
And we talked about it last time as well. So the question then would be... would it help? Would it help to create a world that's not dependent on centralized fossil fuels for to work against this sameness? And would the alternative be better? Because I guess the best thing you could say about sameness, and it's often expressed these days in modernism, but at least it's universal. So perhaps in your thesis, Öde, you could just replace the modernist sameness with classicism, and that wouldn't be that much of a problem. Or is the solution to have localized ideas?
I wouldn't call universal principles of harmony sameness, because you can use different kinds of materials and different kinds of style, like Jugend and the Rococo are two inherently different styles, but they both follow the principles of universal harmony. So
so you mean you can accommodate it without
I understand what you mean. Of course,
yeah.
it's you put gasoline on the fire when you have the world we live in now, where all the same materials are produced and made in the same places and shipped. Of course, you get a lot of sameness.
Yeah,
and it enhances it. But I also think that those people who are in charge of building now, they don't have a cultured background. They're not part of the old bourgeoisie. They are newcomers who have no concept of responsibility in those ways. I mean, like the old nobility. Norway never had a nobility, but like the old upper class in Norway, when they built factories, I mean, for their workers, they even made beautiful factories.
Yeah.
You know, and that was the first thing, the first examples of funkist architecture we have are factories from the 1910s. It was the first thing that went away.
Yeah. Noblesse oblige. That's what they call it in French, English. It's the sort of idea that the rich person has a responsibility, has
obligation.
Yeah, that doesn't exist anymore because we've created a society where, I mean, 99% of super rich people today are newly rich. And we've created a strong government that we expect should work against those rich people. Yeah. The expectations today is that rich people should just try to earn money and the government should leverage that. Yeah. But in the old days, you had a very fine bourgeois class. You had a very nice small government who maybe asked for 0.5% tax every year or something like that. But this bourgeois class, they understood we have money, we have a responsibility, not just for paying good wages, but also for making beautiful buildings and perhaps arrange a concert, bring culture to the city here or something like that. So I think we've got in sameness, we also have that everyone in business today are also pretty similar. That they're all there to just make money.
Yeah, so the problem is not the petroleum, but the ideology.
Right, I agree with Kristian. I think that petroleum makes the fire glow higher, of course.
But that also touches on the point where modernist architecture is not adapted to nature. It means that you're more likely to not survive in a modernist building than in a classical building. If there's suddenly no electricity, no transport, no.
Absolutely. There's no chimney on your house because it's all heated by oil. There's no fireplace, so you have no way of heating it once the power breaks or whatever happens. So at least my hope would be that, let's say solar power. That's a tendency. The two words that I wanted to mention that I forgot last time was, one of them is solar punk, which is like this lovely search word you can go online and watch. There's so many beautiful pictures of like cities in like Art Nouveau architecture, and there's plants everywhere, and it's this sort of like vision of the future that's very positive and that adheres to all of our like rules or ideals of a beautiful humanist surroundings, with the idea that solar power in itself will transform society, or that you mentioned you're critical of, but William Morris, who's of course both very much a traditionalist in art and architecture and believes very much in the craft. But then who's also a socialist, and that's his view of a socialist society is a society that's very much decentralized.
It's anarcho-socialism, basically.
Yeah, perhaps, and it's very eco-oriented. So I don't think there's a lot of like fossil fuels in his ideal society. I think things are made by hand, and that energy is produced locally. Which of course is another potential reply to that whole idea of the state and whether the state should dictate the production of paintings and sculpture and architecture, is that a lot of the centralized power of the state also relies on centralized like literal electric or heat power. So that once that stuff is decentralized, if we believe that that's possible, a solar heater on one roof, a solar panel on the other, and then is there a possibility that might transform culture as well? Or is it just like, or is it just another unprincipled?
Well, it doesn't look like that's where we're heading. We're heading towards more and more centralizations and less and less that people can rely on their own energy. So.
You think so?
Well, I think there's a consensus that society is moving in that direction. Yes. I mean, look at all new energy projects, big windmill parks and or wind turbine parks and big solar parks.
Yeah. But I think you could decentralize it easier than you could do with fossil fuels. Obviously, it's very difficult to dig a coal mine in your own garden, but to put solar panels on your roof, it's quite achievable.
Yeah, but it's so ugly.
Oh, yeah, it can be.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be ugly. Like, it should be, solar punk, it should be beautiful. There's the solar power or the decentralized energy, this William Morris society. The idea is that it will be beautiful, but perhaps it's too much to just sit down and be hopeful that transformation is coming by itself.
Yeah. No, the only thing I can see is, find an architecture firm to cooperate with, and go forth with a good example.
Yeah.
And then other people see it, and then you're getting back to the bourgeois period, so to speak. The people who have money, who want to have houses, and then the architect says, well, what about including some sculpture or painting or whatever? Try to get them to think more along those terms. Yeah,
we could hope so. Well, yeah, I think that's possible too. Just trying to collect as many different approaches to how to strengthen this case as possible. And I think they can come from a lot of different fields. And I understand that for you guys who mostly paint, some of these arguments become very indirect. But I think there's a possibility that replying to larger needs of society can be quite strategic, can be quite useful in promoting our ideas.
That's also where architecture can potentially be a leader in that change, because then you're arguing not purely in terms of the aesthetics or purely about what should be made, how it should look like, but a broader context.
Yeah, so we can pull you with us.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, me too.